Hello and welcome everyone to this Hay Festival April Book of the Month event. Thank you so much to everyone who's donated to the festival's Future Fund when registering for this event. You can continue to support the festival by donating on the website. And our Book of the Month for May will be China Room by author Sanjeev Sahota with a live Q&A coming soon. So I'm thrilled this evening to introduce Benjamin Myers, an author, journalist, and poet whose works include The Offing, Under the Rock, and The Gallows Pole, which was the winner of the Walter Scott Prize and a Roger Deakin Award. He's also the author of folk crime novels Turning Blue and These Darkening Days, the term being coined to describe his work, and a number of other novels, short stories, and poems. He's won the Portico Prize for Literature, the Northern Writers Award, the Tom Gallen Prize, and the Gordon Byrne Prize. And as a journalist, he's written for publications including The Guardian, The New Statesman, The Spectator, and many more. His most recent book, Male Tears, which is available to buy from the Hay Festival website or from your local bookseller, and which we're here to discuss this evening, is a collection of short stories published by Bloomsbury, which explores the male psyche in all its fragility, complexity, and failure, its hubris and forbidden tenderness. It has been described as an era-spanning portrait of just what it means to be a man. Your questions are welcome throughout the session, so please do submit them in the questions tab. I know you'll have a lot to ask Benjamin, and we'll do our best to get through as many of them as possible towards the end of the event. So welcome to all of you, to everybody watching at home, and welcome, Benjamin. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Hi, Laura. Thank you for having me, and hello to everyone who's watching. There's just been thunder and lightning just outside my window about 20 minutes ago, so the stage is set.
Very dramatic. Brilliant.
Yeah.
I want to start by asking you about the title of the book, which is quite provocative. It's a reference or a play on an increasingly controversial phase within the online world, certainly of gender politics. So, to what extent did you want to engage with the current ongoing conversations around gender politics and issues like toxic masculinity? And what made you want to write about this topic now?
Well, first of all, the title was something that I spotted, kind of like an internet meme. I kept seeing it on Instagram. I kept seeing posts of women with mugs of tea or whatever with male tears written on it, and I just thought it was funny. I liked it, and it was such a succinct phrase that seems to sum up everything that I dislike about masculinity, I suppose, which is the kind of, boo-hoo, woe is me, why are men being picked on, and that whole thing that you've written about so much and so well yourself. So the book title is tongue-in-cheek. I wanted it to be funny. I saw a couple of comments online where someone said I'd completely missed the sort of the humor in that phrase, and I don't think I did at all. That's why I chose it. I wanted to gently take the piss out of men, I guess. But the bulk of the stories actually predate the title. I'm mainly a novelist, but I've always been writing stories in between novels as a way to kind of keep in shape, if you like, creatively. And a lot of ideas ended up being stories which started out as novels, and I kind of realized that they weren't sustainable at any great length. And I also didn't have much confidence in my stories. Probably as recently as 4 or 5 years ago, I was struggling to finish stories, and for every 5 that I would write, there might be one decent one. And then it was only a couple of years ago, I sat down with everything and looked at this work that I'd kind of amassed over 15 years. And there was no contrivance to the collection. It was only when I read them that I realized that a lot of these stories were about men and about men's misadventures is kind of the phrase that I've been using, really. And then the phrase toxic masculinity kind of popped up, and I think it's kind of being used possibly by the publisher to kind of describe what the book is about, but I think it's a little bit misleading. I guess it depends how you define toxic masculinity, really, and it's it's quite a broad, as gender is, it's a broad, nuanced thing, but I take it as to mean the worst of male behavior. And with that in mind, I would say that I think toxic masculinity is the root of all the world's problems. All wars, all serial killers, all sort of economic downturns, and also climate change as well. I think it all comes down to male ego, which I would describe as, you know, being part of toxic masculinity. But I would say that this book really is about, it's not about accusing men. It's not about apologizing for men. It's about taking a 360 view of men throughout the ages and throughout in different walks of life, different eras. I think some readers have expected stories which sort of hammer the point home of men being awful, probably to women, and there are elements of that in the book, but hopefully it's a bit more nuanced. Some of the men are very well intentioned, and some are idiotic, and some are striving for survival or glory, or you know, they have ambition, but a lot of the men are misguided. So this is a long-winded way of answering your question, but it's kind of nothing is impartial, but it's hopefully not a judgmental selection of stories. It's trying to paint a broader picture of what it is to be a man, and there's no sort of answer to what it is to be a man, no more than it is what it is to be a woman, really. And I would point out that there are stories about women in there, often in reaction or in response to the men in their lives. And I did toy with putting more stories about women in there, actually, and took some out just to give the collection more of a shape and more of a kind of more of a prevailing theme of, well, toxic masculinity, as it has been called.
And it is certainly a very complex portrait, and not one that hammers the point home at all. It's much more nuanced than that, as you say. A lot of the stories take place against a backdrop of often perhaps discontinued forms of male manual labour, or dying forms of male manual labour. And in some cases, there's a suggestion that this is a tragedy, that in one example, for example, a particular tragedy happens to the central character, and there's a sense that had other men been there working alongside him, it might not have happened, or they might have been able to rescue him. But on the other hand, in many of the stories, men are quite literally chewed up by their own machinery. Is there a sense of tragedy for men in modern progress?
I think so. Yeah, it's a really interesting question, actually, because I was discussing this today with my wife, and the book is coming out in 2 days' time. It's just starting to get reviews, and readers are feeding back, which is always interesting, because I find that I start to learn what the stories mean, because often I just want to tell stories, but if they come from a place of the subconscious, I don't always understand the themes. But I mentioned to my wife that no one seems to have picked up on the themes of kind of post-industrialization, which you just have, so thank you. There are several stories in which men are the victims, as you say, of mechanization, actually. And in my sort of ham-fisted way, it's a way of considering where men are at today. I was born in the 70s, but was a child in the 80s in the northeast of England during the miners' strike, and I grew up just outside of Durham. And while my parents are teachers, so I come from a more middle-class background, but some of my ancestors were coal miners, and kids at school, they were the children of coal miners. So I saw fairly first-hand or second-hand, I guess, of industries that were shutting down, and the shipyards in Sunderland. And in the wake of that, there was a real void. Men kind of lost their purpose, because that kind of a lot of the skilled labor jobs just went very quickly, and there was nothing to replace them. And so I think that's kind of feeling of helplessness, I guess, where you have a labor force who want to work but can't, because if you're 50-year-old, it's hard to retrain as in a call center or whatever was opening up in the 80s and 90s around the Northeast. And it was a lot of call centers. So I think there's kind of echoes of that feeling of tragedy and loss that come into these stories. The one that you referenced is the first story in the book, I think, called A Thousand Acres of English Soil, which is based on a true story. My father-in-law is a farmer, a relatively recently retired farmer, and quite a few of his stories have made it into male tears. And he told me about a guy who was working out in the fields in a sort of 1,000-acre space by himself, and he got sucked into his own machinery and he survived. He actually lost 3 limbs. But the reason I kind of wrote about it is that my father-in-law said, in the past, in the 70s and 80s, he would have been part of a team of 10 or 15 men who would have been there to help each other out. But they've all been replaced by one machine. And while I think modern life is a lot better than it was 30 years ago or 100 years ago or 200 years ago in agriculture, there are side effects of this progress. And one of the side effects is that machines have replaced men in such a way that these accidents can happen. So it's kind of it's a very clumsy way of kind of critiquing the way things have progressed. And some of the other stories are about men who kind of aren't quite sure of their purpose in life. As I said, some of them are just searching for purpose and direction, I think, if that answers your question.
Very much. A lot of the stories position what you describe as the green cathedral of nature as a setting that can be, or perhaps used to be, a very comforting or freeing space for masculinity. And there's often a sense of this perhaps being disrupted or lost. And it really reminded me of a movement I came across recently whilst researching male movements, which was the mythopoetic men's movement. And in the 80s and 90s, the proponents of this movement basically argued that kind of outdoor gatherings and activities were essential to restore masculinity, which had been eroded through relationships with women and involvement in the domestic sphere. In one of the stories, you write of a deep forest setting. Sometimes a man can find God here, sometimes he finds himself instead, other times nothing at all. Do you think that there's been a rupture between men and the natural world?
I don't think it's just men. I think it's people. It's everyone. We're kind of one step removed from nature. And again, it goes back to industrialization, and it's something I kind of explored in my novel, The Gallows Pole, which was set just in the dying days before mass industrialization arrived. And I think it's interesting because even just in the past year during lockdown, there's been a lot of talk and a lot of articles about people discovering nature on their doorstep, and nature writing is big, and wild swimming and these things. It's almost being presented as a new discovery, like, oh, look, if you go out into the fields or the woods, it's very good for you mentally. This isn't a new discovery. This is something that is just inherent within humans for thousands of years, really. But probably in the past 250 years, we've stepped away from it into more domesticated lives. And again, I really would hate to come across as nostalgic for the 18th century, because I know life was rough and people live 20 years longer now for a reason. But I do think that something has been lost in that that sense of well-being that can be achieved by connecting with nature. And it's become a bit of a cliche that nature is healing, because that isn't always the case. In fact, nature can be dark and brutal and full of life and death and these sorts of things. But I think it is important that we still have some connection. We've very speedily moved away from the natural world, actually. And I think perhaps there's a sense of loss within us. You mentioned the idea of the men's group. I mean, part of the reason I'm kind of fascinated by masculinity is because I don't feel part a lot of the time of the group mentality of masculinity, if you guess. I'm not into team sports. I don't go out drinking with groups of men. I'm quite solitary, actually. I was probably a monk or something in a past life. And I'd hate to be seen as a flag waver for masculinity, because I'm not. I'm fascinated by the patterns of behavior, actually. And I'm sort of fascinated by the violent instinct that's in men as well. Why, if we have progressed so much, why is that still in with a lot of men? The need to go out in a pack and attack another pack.
Mhm.
Now, a lot of that has been sanitized, I think, via boxing and mixed martial arts and things like that, which I enjoy watching. I think it's the last vestiges of maybe that's kind of hunter-gatherer thing that's in a lot of men and women. I'm keen to stress and women as well, because we're all part of, the same sort of evolutionary curve. But yeah, my enjoyment of nature is actually generally a solitary thing. I like to go out walking myself and take it in, and a lot of my writing is done outside, in my head, and then I come back and write. I think it's quite important to recognize that, whilst also kind of lamenting the loss of great parts of the natural world.
Well, since you mentioned the kind of that hunter-gatherer, protector, provider role, there is a lot of exploration of those roles in the book, and particularly the idea that those who fail to fulfill those roles are seen as lesser men. One of the stories deals with gender fluidity and cross-dressing and the kind of silence and stigma that surrounds men who dare to transgress stereotypical masculine boundaries. What role do shame and humiliation play in all of this?
I think probably quite a significant role. That story you mentioned is called 10 Men, and it's about a labourer on a farm who's come out of prison, and is working. It's told from the perspective of a young boy, and this man comes and works on his uncle's farm, and outwardly he's very much a straight, hard-working man. But it transpires that he has other kind of aspects to him, and I think these are the men I'm interested in, actually, because these are the men who are at the vanguard of progressing masculinity, really. And while I said that, toxic masculinity is responsible for all the world's problems, really, things are moving forward. I think there are a lot of men who just want quiet lives. They don't want any trouble. They want to be themselves. They want to be free. They want to, if they want to dress in women's clothes or explore sexuality or their own gender, then things are slowly progressing. And a lot of discussions about mental health that have been going on in the past few years, I think are kind of helping that. Mm-hmm. I'm quite fascinated. I think a figure who I've written about, actually, and I've met as a journalist, is Tyson Fury, who is someone I've been following for quite a while. He's a contentious figure, but he kind of is in the background of some of these stories in a way, because he's someone who's I'd heard of his family and his father before I'd heard of him, because he's from quite a notorious family, a traveller, a lot of vile views, actually, early on in his career were expressed in the name of religion. He was homophobic and said a lot of dubious things, and I saw some of his fights, and he was lambasted by the white working class crowds who went to see him, which I thought was fascinating, because he was one of them. But because he's had a lot of mental health problems and has spoken openly about it, I've seen the tide turn, and actually a lot of those white working class males are now on his side. And it's not because he's gone out and battered some heavyweight boxer. It is partly because of that, but it's because he's opened up about his fragility and vulnerability. And while I don't agree, but in conversation, I would probably disagree with some or quite a lot of his opinions now. But I think people should be given the chance to change and evolve and atone for any mistakes, as long as they're willing to kind of admit that they're on some sort of journey. And really, I think that's kind of in some of these stories, not all of them, but the story you mentioned, 10 Men, is about a young boy getting a glimpse kind of beyond what he sees, which is very straight men working on a farm. He gets a glimpse that you can be something else, and it's okay to be that. I'm trying not to give away the twist in the story, but there's a feminine aspect to this very masculine male.
Yes, I've tried not to put too many spoilers in the questions as well. Well, if it doesn't give away too many spoilers, I loved the last story in the book and the longest, which is called Snorri and Frosty. Can you tell me a little bit about the inspiration behind that story and where it grew from? Because it's a very, very specific setting and two very specific central characters.
Yes, that's one of the older stories in the book, and it began. I tried to write a radio play. That's how it began, and it was written over the course of a few days. During the winter, it was December, I think, and snow was falling, and I've no idea where the idea came from, but I wanted to capture the feeling of snow to begin with. So it's about two brothers at the end of their life who have lived together, live a very simplistic life in a kind of log cabin up a mountain somewhere in a unspecified Northern European country. In my mind, it could be Finland or Norway, possibly Iceland, but Iceland doesn't have many trees, and they're actually loggers. So the story really is about the simplicity of their life, and it takes place over the course of one day. And I think perhaps it's maybe a fantasy in my head that life has got complicated. Life in the 21st century is cluttered and noisy and complicated, whereas these two brothers, Snorri and Frosty, live like hillbillies, really. But it's not a critique of that. It's actually it's a sort of warm-hearted, hopefully, portrait of their ability to get along with one another and find pleasure in the little things in life, which are food and snow and chopping down a nice tree. And I'm quite into chopping wood. I don't have any hobbies, but I quite like, there's a wood nearby, and when trees blow over in storms, I sneak in there and I drag the odd one home and I saw it up. And this goes back to about maybe about 10 years ago. I was completely broke and I was trying to write novels, and I was doing this out of necessity to heat the house. So I got quite fascinated by the pursuit of logging. It makes me sound really macho, doesn't it? Like I'm a lumberjack. I'm not. I'm useless. I've got no practical skills, but I'm quite good at breaking things and smashing things. So the story is kind of a reflection of my the simple pleasure of taking a lump of wood and cutting it down to size, and then using that wood to heat the house, because I could barely afford to pay the electricity bills, because I was spending my money on just rent and surviving and working as little as possible in order to write books. So that's, I guess, it's only now that I'm talking to you that I've realized that's why I wrote that story, actually. But yeah, it's about the simplicity. It's about looking at the simple things in life and appreciating them.
Relationships between men and women in these stories are generally deteriorating or worse, and often very much to men's detriment as well as women's. But these are stories of men who just don't seem to be able to grasp the necessary action to save themselves. Are boys failed by a lack of education about how to be in a relationship, and are men failed by their own isolation and inability to reach out to people?
Yes, I think that's an interesting question about boys, because I think all boys need role models. And I suspect it simply boils down to the fact that a lot of boys don't have a kind of a close role model. They might be a footballer or a rapper or a rock star or whatever, but I think boys do need role models, and those role models need to tell the boys the rights and wrongs of how they treat each other and how to treat women. Because if you're not taught that early on, and a lot of your peer group are similar to you, then you're going to be heading off down the wrong path, I think. At the same time, I do think that I do think because of social media and surveillance culture, or whatever you want to call it, young people, boys and girls, teenagers, aren't being allowed to make mistakes. And because I often think back to when I was 14 or 15, and I wasn't a troublemaker, but I got into a few scrapes, and there was a lot of drinking and drug taking and a bit of mischief. And I think, thank God, that wasn't recorded or tweeted or uploaded onto Instagram or TikTok or whatever, because it could really sort of cripple someone's development, I think. So I think young men need guidance, they need role models, but they also need to be given a second chance. Obviously not if they're doing horrific things, but if it's minor infractions, I think people shouldn't be written off at a young age, or at least their home life needs to be understood, I think. There's a lot of things go on with a lot of people that we don't know about. I've been listening to a lot of podcasts recently with criminals, a lot of people who've done life sentences for murder and bank robbery and horrendous crimes, and real hard men, and almost all of them were abused or victimized or beaten. And obviously not everyone who's victimized when they're younger becomes a criminal, but it is the uniting factor in a lot of these men who you would cross the street to avoid. When they talk about things that happened to them when they're 8, 9, 10 years old, it's an explanation. A lot of acts that then take place when they're adults are kind of, it's on them, that they're still responsible for their behavior. But I think when we're talking about teenagers, there's got to be a bit of leeway and a little bit of look at the broader context of why young boys are behaving the way they do. And I think there's gangs of young, gangs are always in the press, gangs of young men with knives or whatever. They're some of the most scared people on the planet, I think. No one carries a knife because they're fearless. It's the opposite. And when I was a young man, I was kind of, there was a few incidents where I was beaten up and attacked for just randomly walking down the street. And I know women live with this constantly, so I'm not kind of diminishing that at all. And all women, any man is a threat to a woman, to a woman. But similarly, I think one thing that's not said very often is that teenage boys live with the threat of getting attacked and beaten up at any given point if they walk along the street themselves. So while gangs of young men can be intimidating, we have to remember that they're scared as well.
Thank you for that. Well, we've got some fantastic audience questions coming in. So although I could ask you my own questions on into the night, I'm going to address some of those over to you so that you can reply to everybody. The first is from Chelsea, and it's a very relevant question to many of the stories in the book, actually. I don't know if she's already read the book, but this is very relevant. Why do you think men grieve so differently from women? And what can we do as a society to address this?
I'm guessing that question is assuming that men grieve a lot more privately. That's a really hard question to answer. I mean, it's because men aren't as expressive as women, perhaps. I mean, I find it hard to believe that men don't feel the same things as women. But yeah, I don't know. I can't answer it because I know that there's still that kind of need within men to hold things back. I think it's changing. I do think it's changing. And I live in Yorkshire, where a lot of Yorkshire men are Yorkshire men, and some of that is there's a phrase. What was it? You can. I can't remember what the phrase is, but a Yorkshire man will always tell you what he thinks. But that's not really true, because a Yorkshire man, and I'm not from Yorkshire, but I've lived here a while. there's a need to keep it repressed and hold it back and hold it in. But I've seen developments recently. I've seen groups form in the area of there was a young rugby player who lived near me who committed suicide a few years ago, and loads of his friends set up a kind of club or a group in his memory for anyone who's feeling down or can't speak out about depression or anxiety or these sorts of things. And I don't know much about it, but I like the idea of all these big, hard, burly men sitting round and kind of consoling each other about their own worries and anxieties. And I think that's progressive to do that. This is not men getting together to slag off women or talk about why they can't have sex with women. It's the opposite of that. It's talking about the burden of masculinity and the expectation that's placed on men. But I think there's still a long way to go before men grieve in the same way as women.
Two questions here about the responses that you've had to the book, and I know it's not quite yet published, but perhaps you've had some early readers. One is, have you seen much of a change in your own relationships with men since writing the book, and do you think men are hungry to have these conversations?
Yeah, well, it's not actually out yet, so it's hard to say. My relationships with men are, most of my friends are kind of weird loners like me as well. They kind of, maybe we're attracted to one another because we're not pack animals, we're not alpha males, and we're probably quite open. But I haven't seen many people for the past year anyway in person. I'm curious as to what people make of the stories. Really, the stories, they're not written for men; they're written for anyone who wants to read them. There's not an agenda to them. What was the other? There was a second part to that question.
Yes, whether men are hungry to have these conversations.
Yeah, I think men are starting to kind of talk about feelings a lot more, and that can only be a good thing. I'm aware that men can't really be told what to do, I think, and that's a fault of masculinity. They have to come to these things at your own pace and for your own reasons. But some of these stories are simply written as entertainment. I'm hoping there's some humor in there. One of the stories that has been mentioned quite a lot to me is a story called Bomber, which is probably the last story I wrote, and that's about, it's a 95% true, and it's about a man who I kind of knew of growing up, who drank in the same pub as me, who had a row with his girlfriend, and in a kind of moment of drunken clarity decided the only way to declare his love for his partner was to go home immediately and paint himself head to toe with black paint, which he did, and he nearly died because all the pores on his skin became blocked. And as I point out in the story, it wasn't racial at all. He only had a tin of gloss black paint to hand. And this is something I actually discussed with my editor when we were working the book. She said to me, does the paint have to be black? Can we change it to gold or bronze? And I said, it kind of has to be black because that's what happened. And this guy nearly died. And as grim as this story is, I actually found it quite funny because that was a romantic gesture on his part. As I said, it wasn't a racial commentary. It was like, what's the most sort of expressive thing I can do? And there's no rhyme or reason as to why you would do that. A bunch of flowers would probably suffice. So that's another aspect of masculinity. I don't think a woman would do that. It's the kind of idiocy of men and the kind of folly and just blind stupidity, really. And because it can be funny, I think. So yeah, that's an example of that in the collection, I think.
And some of our audience members have questions about you as a writer and about your writing process. One says specifically about confidence as a writer. When do you and how do you shirk imposter syndrome when putting your words out there for readers?
I can't. I'm quite an anxious person. I'm a worrier, really. The only time when I'm not really worrying is when I'm writing. I find when I'm sitting creating these sort of worlds, imaginary worlds, is when I feel free and I feel relaxed. When it comes to having to explain the work or discuss it or promote it, such as now, imposter syndrome kicks in a big way. And I don't mind admitting that I've been kind of nervous all afternoon about having to explain the stories, because as I said at the start, I don't really know what a lot of them are about. So the imposter syndrome is there and it's never gone away. But it's not an imposter syndrome that's concerned with the writing as such. It's more the presentation of me as a person. Because I think I became a writer so that I could hide from the world and so that I didn't have to get up on stage and perform and talk. And lo and behold, it turns out that if you start selling a few books, there is an aspect of public kind of expectation. And I struggle with that because I don't think writers are comedians or raconteurs or entertainers. Some are, and they're brilliant at it. I would possibly argue that some of the best performers aren't necessarily the best writers, because a lot of my favorite writers are the weird, fucked up individuals who are sat at home chewing their fingernails. I mean, I don't drink alcohol for a reason, because I think if I did, I'd probably be drinking a lot of alcohol, especially now with a book coming out. So the imposter syndrome is there. And it was only recently I decided to give it a name. And the name is Ronnie. So whenever I'm feeling anxious or whatever, I think, oh, Ronnie's here. And my grandfather, who lived to 103 and was a very nice man, was called Ronnie. So that's my way of tackling it this week anyway.
That's fantastic. And I was going to ask you, actually, there is one quite personal story in the book set in Vienna where you reveal a little bit about your own experiences of anxiety in particular. And if it's not too personal a question, I was going to ask about your own experiences of the kind of strictures and pressures of masculinity that these stories explore.
Yeah, I mean, that story was based on a trip my wife and I took about 3 years ago to Vienna to see a Bruegel the Elder exhibition of paintings. It was sort of the biggest, most sort of anticipated exhibition of paintings in Europe at the time, which is kind of by the by, really. It was that was just the setup for the story. But when we went to Vienna, I'd just submitted my last novel, my previous novel, The Offing, and it was completely mentally frazzled. And I'd recently won a literary prize, and after years of being on an independent publisher, I'd signed to Bloomsbury, and I felt like things I'd been dreaming of for years had suddenly were starting to happen, and that had quite a strange effect on me, where I was just completely exhausted. And we went to Vienna to see this exhibition, and I was just overwhelmed by it because it was so busy and so crowded. And it was just one way of illustrating what it feels like to have a panic attack, which I didn't actually have when I was there, but I thought I came quite close to it. But it's only in the past few years that I realized that I've probably been anxious all of my life, really, or certainly since I started school. And I don't know whether it's to do with masculinity or not, but I think I used to get overwhelmed by being in a busy, noisy classroom and a rough and tumble life of being a boy. I was quite bookish, and I was the smallest in my year at school, and I had glasses, and I wasn't bullied, and I wasn't a softie, and I actually had quite a lot of fights because I I reacted to all that by using my mouth. So I would be verbal when I couldn't defend myself, and then that would escalate into scraps. But it was probably in the past 5 or 10 years that I thought, I went to see a counselor for a little bit, and she basically explained what anxiety is and where it comes from. And when you finally give a name to something, it becomes more tangible, and I'm not crippled by it at all. I just think I probably, it's caused by certain things like public performances and talking about myself too much, actually. But now that I've kind of got a grasp on it, you just live with it. And I think it's part of being a writer. And I think a lot of writers who I've spoken to feel something quite similar. It's not exclusive to writers. Someone who, in any occupation or work of life, people can experience anxiety. But one thing I've found that helps is kind of talking about it, because people are very sympathetic, and no one has ever said, you idiot, grow up, man up, which is the worst phrase ever, grow up, all that. People are quite understanding.
And speaking of being a writer, another audience question is, you've clearly sacrificed a lot to be a writer. What is so great about it?
Well, I think the only sacrifices I've really made is I probably could have had progressed in journalism. I started out at music magazines, and I probably could have ended up maybe as higher up editing magazines or something. But I knew that I wanted to write, because there's nothing better. It's time travel, and it's flight, and you can experience anything you want via writing. And it's very indulgent, and it's very privileged, and I feel really lucky. Although you kind of have to make your own luck a little bit, I think, because a lot of my novels were turned down by publishers for years. And I sort of became a bit like a kind of Yorkshire Terrier. I refused to let go. I just kept coming back and biting at the heels, which is a real sort of stubborn northern attitude, I think. But I just knew that I couldn't give up, because if I gave up, then there really is nothing else I can do beyond writing. And everything I've done career-wise has been connected in some way or another to writing, whether it's writing copy for advertising or interviewing bands for music magazines or reviewing books. It's my default setting, and I've lived in fear for years that I'll have to grow up and get a real job, because it's not a real job. It's totally indulgent, and I have to stop myself when I'm kind of moaning, oh God, I've got to do this, or someone wants to interview me, and then I stop and think, there are nurses on the front line saving people's lives and at risk. And what am I doing? I'm just telling stories. So I have to shut up and just remember to enjoy it, I think.
Well, we've certainly very much enjoyed hearing about it this evening. So thank you so much for so generously answering all of these questions and sharing your time. Unfortunately, that's all we've got time for, but thank you to everybody who's joined us, to everybody who asked questions. Thank you for continuing to support the Hay Festival. Do join us next month for China Room, for the Q&A about that May Book of the Month. And do pick up a copy of Male Tears from the Hay Festival website or your local bookseller. It's absolutely fantastic, and asking so many questions and exploring so many aspects of masculinity that aren't really being talked about. I can't recommend it enough. Thank you so much, Benjamin Myers, for joining us this evening, and a huge virtual round of applause from everybody and from me.
Thank you, Laura, and thanks to everyone who's interrupted EastEnders or their tea, or God forbid the one show, for tuning in. So thanks.